So now that we've set up our experiment, John's going to actually collect some data and analyze or check over his results. So John comes up with a table that he can use to record his data. I know you've probably recorded information in a table before, especially in math or science class, but he's going to make sure that he has a nice, neat place to write down any observations he finds, including his measurements. He gets all his materials together and carries out his investigation. The table that John creates looks kind of like this. Across the top, he has his 3 trials. He's going to fill in this information with the size of his bread loaf. And then down the side, he has his independent variable, or the amount of sugar that he's putting in each one. So his independent goes on the y-axis, up and down. His dependent variable goes on the x-axis, which is across. And then he's going to make sure that he has his average size here. He's going to actually find the volume, length times width times height, of his bread, and go ahead and fill in the average for all 3 trials. So when John conducts his experiment, he makes his observations. As he measures each one, he writes them down, and his table winds up looking like this. So you can tell he looked at all of his measurements. He found the average size. He wrote them all down. In each trial, there was a little bit of a difference. So for example, in his 25 grams of sugar, one of his bread loaves came out to be 730 cubic centimeters. Another one came out to be 680. So there might have been something very slightly different about them, but that's why you use an average, so we can see what this data looks like as a whole. So looking at this data, what I want you to do on the next question, it's going to be an open-ended question. What do you notice about this data? Which bread was the biggest? Which bread was the smallest? Use this data and see what changes as the sugar changes. What do you notice about this data? Go ahead and do that now. All right. What John noticed as he looked at this data is that the 100 grams of sugar worked best. He's trying to make the largest loaf of bread, and if we look back at his table, 100 grams of sugar came out to be 1,310 centimeters on average, which is a little bit bigger than his 50 grams of sugar, then was 25, then 250, and then 500. So more sugar did not necessarily help. However, by adding some sugar to his grandma's recipe, he was able to make a larger loaf of bread. So John noticed that 100 grams is going to be like the sweet spot. Where do we get the largest loaf of bread? Now he's analyzing his results. In his conclusion, John's going to go back to his hypothesis that he wrote at the beginning of his experiment. He said, if more sugar is added to this recipe, then the bread will rise higher. Should he accept or reject his hypothesis? When we talk about hypotheses, we don't say you're right or wrong because it's just a prediction and an educated guess. We say accept or reject. So if John's hypothesis was correct that adding more sugar than 50 grams is going to make his bread larger, then we would accept it. If he's incorrect and when he added more sugar, it got smaller, then we would reject it. So what do you think? Should we accept or reject his hypothesis? John's going to accept his hypothesis. He saw that with 100 grams of sugar, he produced the largest loaf. His starting amount was 50 grams. Therefore, he was correct. Adding more sugar made a larger loaf of bread. If we kept analyzing that data, we would see that if we keep adding sugar, it doesn't help. But for now, John's hypothesis was correct. So his last step that he's going to do is to communicate his results. John's going to tell his grandmother about his findings, and he prepares his presentation for his science class so that he can tell them his findings. Tomorrow, we're going to look at how we would actually put those results onto paper, how we would write them down and communicate them to somebody else using our claim, evidence, and reasoning. For today, you're going to finish up by taking a pretty quick exit ticket that involves analyzing some data of your own. So you have 3 tables and charts that you're going to look at and see if you can find what the conclusion for those experiments should be. You're going to do that on the next slide, which is your Google form, and then make sure you click submit and hit mark as done.